for some reason, my recording stopped. So I'm just going to pick up from where I left off rather than just start over. So I'm going to just divide this into a part 1 or part 2 or splice them together. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'll figure out how to do it. Moving on. So these pull factors. Another push factor was a lot of these Germans were participating in some radical political movements. So many of them were socialists and communists. And during the mid-19th century, there were a lot of political upheavals. And especially in 1848, those of you who remember from world history, remember there was a lot of revolutions, and these revolutions largely failed, and a lot of the supporters of those revolutions had to hightail it out of Germany, and then many of them came to the United States, where it was perceived that it was a lot freer to pursue your political ends during that particular time period. So those were the pull factors: relatively more freedom, political freedom, and access to cheap and available land. And Germans during this time are going to become farmers. Some of them are going to become political activists and education activists. And then finally the Chinese. Now China during the mid-19th century was a mess. I mean, it was the end of their dynasty. There was a lot of European incursions and interventions. There was spreading opium and drug use. I mean, there was just huge social upheavals going on in China. There had been a huge famine that wiped out about 20 million people. It was really not a good place to be. A lot of Chinese, especially Chinese men, decided they were going to leave China and they're going to find their way to the Americas. Some of these poor Chinese are going to find themselves in the guano mines in South America. But we don't need to talk about that right now. But many of the Chinese are going to come into the West, and ultimately they're going to be attracted by the gold rush of the late 1840s in California, hoping to find gold. Ultimately, they'll find their way, building railroads and things along those lines. Now, these different groups came in. They were oftentimes alien groups. They were not necessarily well liked by Americans. And many of them were going to find their homes in what we call ethnic enclaves, where they're going to live together with other people who are just like them. The Irish tended to congregate together. The Germans tended to congregate together and create their own communities. And of course, Chinese were famous for their Chinatowns. The benefits that this provided was, especially once these towns were established, they were a place where you could go, where you could live, where the culture was relatively familiar to you. And people spoke the same language, and there weren't the same kind of pressures to assimilate. But it was also an area where newer immigrants coming into these ethnic enclaves could make social networks by which they could prosper and profit and benefit. Americans... Wow. Americans have always had this kind of love-hate relationship with their immigrants. On the one hand, we like the fact that immigrants usually provide cheap labor and usually do the jobs that we would rather not do. We like having that available labor, and we like to have those particular jobs done. On the other hand, we get very, very nervous when large numbers of a particular immigrant group come into the United States, because then we start to perceive them as being a threat to our cultural traditions. And that is exactly how these particular groups, especially the Irish and the Chinese, later on the Germans will be considered a threat for other reasons, but especially groups as different as the Chinese and the Irish that were a challenge to religious norms and cultural norms of that particular time. So some of the reaction from the Americans was discrimination. And oftentimes groups specifically designed to intimidate and push away and ostracize these particular immigrant groups. Now, along with industrialization, we also have an issue called urbanization, and urbanization is going to be the result of certain factors. So, for instance, we have the availability of jobs are going to be in one particular area. The factories are going to be in areas that are conducive to factories, usually near a water source, usually in existing cities. So that's where the people are going to go for the jobs. Also, too, we have expanding populations. The populations are growing, and oftentimes those populations growing, especially if they've been displaced, are going to move into the cities, and these cities are going to spread and become larger. And also the availability of jobs. As we start to lose jobs in the rural centers, people are going to be moving to the cities and getting those jobs. And the cities was where the money was. So, but in many cases, these cities were growing faster than they could cope. I mean, here's a really good example of an urban slum here. And you can kind of see how these buildings and these dwellings are not probably your best built dwellings. I mean, some of these look like hodgepodge and kind of thrown together. These challenges include sanitation. Many of these cities did not have a sewer system, for instance. These cities developed relatively slowly, and people simply did their thing the way they always did their thing. They built latrines. They built holes in the ground. But now you have a population increase that is unsustainable using that particular system. Well, then who has to pay for that system? How do we build a sewer system in these cities? Somebody's got to make that work. Housing. As you can see, as more and more immigrants move into the cities, the demand for housing increases, but the labor, the demand for the ability to get higher wages decreases because of the more people. So you have decreasing wages, you have increasing value of property, which means that that folks in the lower end of this spectrum are going to get hurt really, really bad as far as housing is concerned. Housing was substandard, subpar. There were no laws put into place to say that a house had to be built to certain specifications to make sure that it was safe and clean, and consequently, the less money you had, the lower the quality of your home, and the chances were pretty good that you were sharing your home with somebody else in order to pay the rent. And stability. You can imagine that these large pools of poverty, you also have large pools of immigrants who were less invested in the community than others. And you also have the mixing of different ethnic groups that don't necessarily really like each other, such as the British and the Irish, and other groups. So this is going to become a bit of a problem, and stability is going to become a problem in the cities. Crime is going to become a problem, and in fact, cities were ultimately going to have to start investing in police forces, whereas earlier it was relatively easy to simply have night watchmen patrolling the streets to make sure everything was okay, or maybe you would hire a constable or two to kind of keep to roll the drunk, so to speak. But now we actually are going to have to pay and sustain an active and full-time police force, and this is going to be quite the task for the cities. Now, class, of course, is going to be influenced by class. The lower you were in the class spectrum, the more likely you were to be living in substandard conditions, the more likely you were to be involved in crime. Whereas if you were of upper class, you still want to live in the cities, because the cities where the money is and the cities where the capital is, and that's where your investments are taking place. You may own a factory that is located somewhere in and around that city, but you're not going to live here. You are going to live on another side of the city in which you can have a large home and a fence around it. And of course, you will make sure that that city passes laws to keep these people away from your people. So class is going to be a huge influence on this. And of course, this is going to involve changes in the social order. Social classes during this time are no longer going to be particularly solid. They're going to be more flexible. It is now possible for somebody like a John Jacob Astor to go out into and build a fur empire and then invest that money that he gets in the fur trade and create a fur business, a fur-based business, and then invest that money even further out and become ultimately a millionaire. I mean, it is possible for that to happen. It was also very, very possible it was more likely actually that people who were in a working class situation, if they could get the right skills and education, they might be able to work themselves into the middle class. Now, and what goes up must come down as well. Other people who may have been considered middle class, like skilled craftsmen, are finding their jobs, their livelihoods destroyed by industrialization. They're going down in the social ladder and ending up in the lower classes. What do I mean by a middle class? Anyway, a middle class is that group that is kind of in the middle of the social class spectrum. Of course, they're making money, but they're not making enough money in order to live independently on their investments. That would be somebody who is wealthy. The middle class is making enough money in which to have a surplus that they can invest as they see fit. And they can invest in luxuries, they can invest in investments that will produce more money. But they are people who must work for a living, but In doing so, they're able to build a surplus and maintain a higher level of lifestyle. And this middle class is going to be hugely important. As people move into the middle class, we start to see certain gender changes. The expectations of women in the middle class is that they're going to stay home and they're going to take care of the children and they're going to take care of the domestic tasks, while the man goes out and makes a living. Those gender differences didn't exist in the lower classes. If you were lower class living in the cities, then, sorry, everybody's going to the factory. The man, the woman, the kids, everybody. So you don't necessarily see those gender differences. But as society becomes more and more of a middle-class society, those gender expectations become more and more the norm. So especially among middle class now, middle class, they have enough money set aside. Now they can actually take that money, and now they're going to start taking that money and investing it in their children. We want our children to also be middle class, or maybe even more than middle class, wealthier. Well, that means if you're middle class and you only have so much of a surplus, you only have so much to spend on your children, you have fewer children. The children, instead of actually becoming a boon, such as people who were working on the farms in the old days, had more and more children to help them bring in more and more of a product. Now the children, in an industrial society, and children are kind of a burden. They're not necessarily going to improve your productive output. They are an investment. So we're going to have fewer of these children, and sure enough, we're actually going to see the fertility rates in the United States decline from about 7 children per family to about 4 or 5 children per family. And of course, women during this time, their focus then is going to be in taking care of that investment. The children, and making sure that the children get an education. Remember, the early 19th century, there was not necessarily much of a public education system. Yes, some areas had public education, but much of the United States, if you wanted to educate your children, you had to pay for that. And the more you wanted to educate your children, the more you had to pay. Well, this is going to create a huge problem. If you have too many children, then some of your children are going to get educated and some of them are not. So we even that out by having fewer children. We're also starting to see a difference here in time and how we perceive time. Work in a pre-industrial society and work in agricultural societies was one in which you could work and then you could stop working. If a friend came by, you could put down your plow, you could talk to your friend, you could go back, pick up your plow. And work was a little bit more self-motivated. And the barriers between leisure time and work time were a little bit more variable. Sometimes you could just have a party by bringing in people to help you bring in your crops. So there was an overlap between work time and leisure time. But in an industrial society, and even when industrialization is spread into the farms now, we're going to see that those industrial owners are going to want you at work at a particular time. And they're going to want you to work until a particular time is over, and then it is your time. And of course, it becomes incumbent upon the factory owner to keep you at work as long as they possibly can keep you at work. And we start to see a development in which we are recognizing work time and leisure time, time that belongs to my boss and time that belongs to me. We also are getting a different idea and understanding of place. In pre-industrial societies and agricultural societies, work took place in and around the home. There was no different. The home was the center of productivity in these cultures. But in an industrial culture, you go to work and then you come home. And home and work are two different places. And the expectations are different. We're also seeing the breakdown of the northern yeoman farmer communal exchange, and now we're looking at systems of cash exchange. This is a breakdown of the barter system and the old exchange of goods, and now we are developing into a cash economy where it is expected that you're going to have the money to pay for your goods instead of just giving me a couple of chickens for 20 pounds of potatoes or whatever the going rate was in chickens and potatoes. Who knows what that is? But or I'm going to help, as a doctor, I'm going to go and help take care of your sick child, and in return, you're going to give me a bag of turnips. Well, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go and take care of your sick child, and I want you to pay me with money that I can exchange for goods and services, or that I can invest. So we're going to see some very, very significant social changes and cultural changes as well. That does it. And again, there's a lot of stuff going on, but basically the primary motivator here is the Industrial Revolution and the market changes that are going to come from a growing industrialized society. We're also going to see that this industrialization and factory system is going to be concentrated largely in the northern states, whereas southern states and western states are going to be more invested in farming, and the regional differences and different interests that are going to come and arise as a result of that. Thank you very much.